anyone that came by last year saw this talk. I've kind of switched things up a little bit. So the title of my talk today is going to be The Art of Being a Frog. And basically what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the diversity of frogs, or some of the diversity of frogs we have in our world, and what it kind of means to be a frog. There's a lot of frogs that exist in our environment, and a lot of them come in all different sizes, shapes, and a lot of them have different ecologies and functions. So today will hopefully be a good kind of introduction, for what is a frog and how many, different frogs actually exist out there. And so just to kind of start off with my background, ever since I was a little kid, I've always kind of been fond and interested in frogs. So when I was about like 7 or 8 years old, I ended up moving to a small neighborhood. And in the neighborhood, there was actually this pond, just a few hundred feet away from my house. And what I would do is I would go down to this pond and catch frogs, turtles, and this kind of inspired me to, kind of be interested in wildlife. And I don't really, people always ask me, like, what is it about a frog that makes it super interesting? Because, a lot of people kind of find frogs kind of slimy and gross, but to me, I think they're just, super unique organisms. They are one of the few organisms that can actually make calling sounds, and I just think, in my opinion, they just look really, really cool. And, fast forward to today, so I still do catch frogs. It turns out frogs aren't just cool, but they're actually really, really useful, like model organisms for studying environmental change. And so, frogs are ectotherms, which means they rely on kind of the external environment to maintain stability in their body temperatures. So that can make them like very vulnerable to, climate change and other shifts in the environment that otherwise maybe wouldn't affect other organisms as much. And then, frogs are also, bioindicators in a lot of ecosystems. And they're, very sensitive to, again, those changes in the environment. So they do serve as really powerful models, in my opinion, to, studying, changes that we can observe in nature. And so on the left is a photo of a green tree frog, which is a species I used to work on when I was in grad school. And then on the right is a photo of what's called a crawfish frog, which is a very kind of secretive frog that lives in the United States. So I'll hopefully get to talk to you about a little bit more about maybe these two specific frogs later on. But anyways, so those are just two frogs I'm kind of close, my heart is very close to. And so here I'm going to try to, hopefully these videos work, I'm going to try to play a couple of videos of kind of how I collect frogs in the field. So this is kind of what I call a visual encounter in hand capture. So you'll kind of approach a frog. It might be calling, so it might be really easily, it might be very easily detectable. So here's a video of kind of what a green tree frog sounds like in nature. So obviously, you pull up to a pond, you hear a frog calling, and it's pretty easy to, catch. But sometimes they can be really, really hard to find. So green tree frogs get their name because they're green, and they hang out in green vegetation. So they can be, very, very well camouflaged. And so in this right video, this frog is not only camouflaged to the background of the plants that it's on, but it's also, it's very shy, I guess you could say. So a lot of frogs, if they kind of hear someone approaching a pond, or they see like some headlamp or flashlight, they'll just stop calling. So what you can actually do when you're in the field, if you're trying to collect frogs, you can actually try to imitate their call and mimic their call. So in this video, you can hear me, to the best of my ability, trying to imitate this frog's call, and it ends up calling back. So you can kind of elicit a response back. So you kind of trick the frog into calling back. So hopefully this one plays too. You can kind of hear me trying to do my best for the call. Wink, wink, wink. Wink, 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 wink. Okay, so yeah, and you can see that frog got tricked by me. But yeah, so that you end up kind of finding them over time. So sometimes you'll just be calling forever, and then eventually you'll kind of elicit a response. Okay, so then there's other kind of methods I use in my research, and this is a pretty common method for in general reptiles and amphibians. So it's called drift fencing with pitfall traps. And so basically, essentially how this works is you kind of set up a fence maybe around a pond or around an area of high activity. And what happens is once those frogs, start to leave to go towards the ponds, they'll actually hit this fence. So it's kind of like a barrier, right? And so when they hit the fence, you can kind of see that this is a little trap or a pitfall trap. So you can actually dig buckets and put them along the fence. When the frog hits the fence, it'll start traveling one way or the other. So it might start going left, and then eventually it'll just fall into the bucket. So you can periodically check these buckets and find frogs that are trying to enter the pond, because eventually the frog's going to go around until it can try to find a way in. And then once we capture these frogs in the buckets, then we can put them on the other side of the fence and release them after taking measurements and collecting other types of data. But you can get tons of data from this type of from these type of methods. So if you wanted to go to a pond and try to figure out population sizes for a certain species, or try to get a measure of species diversity, you can get so much rich data like sex ratios, and once you start collecting more and more frogs, you can kind of get a good idea for how big the frogs are, and other things that might be related to your studies, such as disease and things of that nature. And this is kind of one of the, drift fences I was kind of worked on for a project. So this is a drift fence I set up in southeastern Oklahoma, and this drift fence is about 900 feet long, and we have a total of 50 of those pitfall traps, so 25 on the outside, and then 25 traps on the inside. So you can imagine this fence has, or had a lot of potential to catch a lot of frogs and other amphibians and reptiles. But you can see that in these little buckets down here along the fence. So if you zoom in on one of those buckets, you can see that kind of how this works for how it catches the frogs. But so this bucket, you can see there's 3 different species. So the bigger one is a crawfish frog. This little guy is a species of forest frog, and then this guy hanging on the corner is actually it's called an American toad. So again, these are kind of the basic trapping methods for conducting frog research in general. And here's just some data from one of the years from working at that drift fence. So these are just the 5 most common frogs that I found in this area, or in this single pond. There was a lot more species found here, but these are just the more common ones. So you can see that based on just 1 year's of data and a couple months time frame, we found 92 crawfish frogs, over 400 toads, 130 leopard frogs, over 100 of these little forest frogs, and then about 30 of these pickerel frogs. And what you'll notice is these blue lines indicate frogs that enter. So on the y-axis we have number of individuals coming in, and then on the x-axis we have the date of capture. So you see the blue lines indicate frogs that enter the pond, while the red lines indicate frogs that exit the pond. So you can kind of notice trends in when these frogs are actually breeding in the pond, which is actually pretty useful for trying to understand more about the species, right? And so you'll notice that some frogs, like this leopard frog, they have a very kind of broad, duration from when they breed. You can see that they exited into the pond throughout the whole time of the study. But then when we look at things like American toads, you'll notice that they only were in the pond for a brief 2-week period of time. So it's kind of cool. You can kind of compare and contrast species and learn about their different ecologies. And some species might be very explosive breeders, while others are more kind of longer duration based breeders. So those are kind of some examples of data you can actually obtain from kind of these trapping method studies. And then also, this is another kind of cool component you can kind of gain from these, drift fence studies too. So if you, so here's kind of an aerial view of this drift fence pond. You can see all these white circles are those pitfall traps I was talking about earlier. And then, so once you can kind of once you collect your data on what species are coming in from different areas of the pond, you can kind of make assumptions about what might be important for certain types of species. So, for example, one of our species, you can see that most of the, I guess, entering locations for the species came from this western, southwestern direction, and you can't really see based on this figure, but actually in this area there was a lot more like kind of wooded habitat, so you can kind of make inferences about that species and how it might be very ecologically tied to these more wooded habitats compared to these more opened kind of barren landscape areas that might be on the other side of the fence or on the other side of the pond. So some species might be basically overwintering in sites that are under logs and kind of under leaf litter, which might not exist elsewhere relative to the pond. So again, these are the type of data you can actually start learning a lot more information about specific species and what might be important for their ecology and even their conservation if you're trying to do some like habitat management for future efforts. And this is kind of a cool, and I know that some of this stuff at the beginning is just kind of methods-based stuff, but this is kind of just showing you like how you can actually mark specific individual frogs. So you can use what are called these pit tags, which on the top left you can kind of see one there, but these are basically like essentially little microchips you can use for individual identification. So what happens is like if there's this one species I was studying, you can kind of make a small little cut on their abdomen, just on their skin, and you can put this tag in there. And actually, after 1 day, we've recaught these frogs, and their skin has fully healed over. So it's not a very invasive method. But you can see that the purpose of this is if you're trying to maybe assess, how many individuals are in a pond, you don't want to actually capture the same individual over and over again. So you want to give some individuals, like, again, a unique identification. So then you can even start tracking things like, growth rate, how many times you've actually captured it, and it's a very useful way to, again, measure and mark these individual frogs. So that's kind of a cool representation of what it looks like when it's inside the frog. And then I'll also do a little bit of, I guess, morphology work too. So on the left, you can see that that's a X-ray or a radiograph of a bunch of green tree frogs. And so morphology is very useful for like species identification and trait function. So you can actually get really cool, detailed, oriented measurements on like frog bones and toe pads and things of that nature. And then you can also do, I guess, a different method for kind of morphological analysis, which is this method on the right. It's called basically it's called micro CT scanning. You can actually, instead of doing, so this on the left is a radiograph, that's a 2D plane. If you use this method, you can basically get this like three-dimensional shape of what what the frog bones actually look like. And again, this is kind of this is a better approach for getting that rich type of data. And then this is kind of, again, I really like this method because I've been recently working with it. So you basically can put a frog into a machine, and this machine will spin and rotate this frog, right? And so what's happening is there's thousands of X-rays that are being emitted from one side, and then there's a detector plate that absorbs all these X-rays. So as the frog's spinning, it's getting a different angle of that frog in time and space. And so what happens is you can actually reconstruct these X-rays and kind of put them all together, and you can kind of get this, again, this three-dimensional image, which is actually really, really useful, again, for getting those very detailed-oriented things you might not be able to get from measuring something with, a ruler or, again, those 2D radiographs. So this is a frog skull on top of, this is just an example of what I was able to pull from this crawfish frog. So again, this is a kind of a newer, I guess, method for using kind of morphology for kind of data analysis and data management. And then this is kind of what you can actually, if you collected a bunch of data, skull data on different species that are like closely related, you can kind of tease apart differences among species. So this data is really useful for like species delimitation and when you're studying species that look very, very similar. So these are 4 frogs that are all pretty related. So these frogs on the right, these 3 right here, these are all kind of in the same clade. They look very similar, and they most likely have similar morphologies. And so what you can do is when you can plot this data from the skulls, you can kind of see like relationships that individuals share among species, and you can kind of see the differences among species. And so you can kind of see that this is a gopher frog on the bottom and a crawfish frog on the top. You can see these species have like very, very robust and wide skulls versus these, leopard frogs and pickerel frogs. I showed you earlier, they have very narrow skulls. And then you can see there's differences also in like the pointiness, how rounded they are at the snout. And again, this is kind of a very useful way of looking at differences among species. And some species you can't really tell apart phenotypically. If you're just looking at one species and another species, sometimes they look exactly the same. So these type of morphological data can be very useful for actually distinguishing them from each other. And here's what you call like an evolutionary relationship or a phylogeny of these skulls plotted. And so on the very left is this is an older species. People will say it's more ancestral, and then on the very right is the more derived species, right? So it's the more recent species. And what you'll notice is as you go from the older species to the newer species, you'll see kind of the skull gets a little bit wider and wider. So this is actually very, very useful. This is actually very cool. You kind of see trends over time. So maybe over time, the species has been developing, a wider skull. And it's kind of cool to also relate things back to ecology. So these three frogs at the bottom, they all use different subterranean shelters and burrows that are not used by this leopard frog. So crawfish frogs live in crayfish burrows, gopher frogs live in gopher tortoise burrows, and these pickerel frogs live in cave systems. So sometimes it makes you think, how much of their skull morphology is actually being contributed from their, unique ecology and what they use in their environments. And so those are just some examples of, kind of some research I do and kind of how certain methods might be useful. But now I'm going to start talking to you guys about what it means to be a frog and what are frogs. So I'll start out with some basic vocabulary here. So amphibians basically consists of three groups. So the group is called Lissamphibia, but there's frogs and toads, which is the order Anura. Then you have salamanders, which are usually called Quadrata, and then you have this weird group called caecilians, which I do have one slide on caecilians because they don't really get talked about as much. I don't know if anyone, if you have heard of caecilians, you should say something in the chat because I'd be really curious to see if anyone's heard about these organisms. But they're a very understudied group of amphibians. And not a lot of people talk about them and know, I guess, a lot about their ecology because they're very, very cryptic and secretive. But so these are the number of species we have. And I did this talk last year. So last year there was 7,668 frogs, okay? And there was 816 salamanders, and then there was 222 species of caecilians. So if we fast forward to today, I went back and checked the updated species counts. We have now gained, about 200 new species of frogs, and we've gained, a few more species of salamanders, and we've also gained about 3 more species of caecilians. So this is kind of just showing that, as time goes on, we're always discovering new species. A lot of amphibians are not very well surveyed, and they're kind of, found in these, these hard to get to habitat types. And they live in these remote areas sometimes, and again, they're very, very secretive. A lot of amphibians exclusively live underground, so they can be very, very hard to detect in the wild. So it's super cool that we, as time goes on, we're actually seeing more species get discovered. That's a pretty cool little nitbit. But okay, and so what actually is a frog? So frogs, if you were to look at kind of like an evolutionary tree, they are a group that basically evolved about 300 million years ago. So they're actually older than mammals. I think mammals evolved about 225 million years ago. And again, we have these three different groups. You have the caecilians, and then we have, the split between salamanders and frogs, which are kind of again a more recent groups. And I do have a slide on caecilians because, and this is the only slide I have on them. This is not a caecilian talk, but I figured I'd try to like give you guys some cool facts about these guys because otherwise they kind of get swept under the rug a little bit. But they can be, so they're such a weird group of animals. They're very diverse. Some of them look like worms. Some of them look like snakes. They can be terrestrial or aquatic, so they can. Some species live only in the water. Some species live pretty much underground their entire lives. But what's really cool about this species is that they have this, I guess, sensory tentacle. No one really, I don't know if anyone really knows exactly what the sensory tentacle is used for, but it's thought to help for detecting chemical cues and signals. So a lot of people think it's for prey detection and navigation through environments in which they can't see very well. So it's kind of like an environmental sensor, if you will. And some of them also have these and these are just some. I really like skulls. So this is an example of a skull from one species, and you'll notice that the skull is again very robust and very thick, dermally speaking. So this is a skull that's pretty much designed and adapted to dig underground. So the way the skull is shaped is basically kind of goes to show how fossorial these creatures are. And this is some of them look cute. Like this one on the bottom looks like a little worm. It's kind of cute, but this one just looks scary. The one that has all these teeth. And I think it kind of looks like an alien. So again, this is a very weird, diverse group. I encourage you if you're really interested in this group of animals to do some more research on them on your own because they have again incredible diversity and incredible different ecologies. Okay. So what actually is a frog? So frogs. So the order of frogs is called Anura. And that's Latin, and what it means is it means without a tail. So it's like kind of an animal without a tail. But some of you may be thinking, okay, well, what about tadpoles? Tadpoles have tails, right? And that is true. So there are exceptions to the without a tail definition. For our biphasics, they have a tadpole stage, which is generally kind of this aquatic stage, and then when they metamorph and become terrestrial stage, they kind of lose this tail or reabsorb this tail. And there's another exception to this kind of rule to without a tail, and there's this one species of frog. It's called a tailed frog, but this is kind of misleading because it's not actually a true tail. So their tail doesn't really have any vertebrae or bone structure. Instead, it's kind of an extension of its digestive tract. And another weird thing about this frog is that so most frogs use external fertilization, but this frog actually uses internal fertilization, so it's kind of doing the opposite of what most frogs do. And then the other thing that's also really weird about this frog is that they don't call. So most frogs have this acoustic signaling that they do. This frog just doesn't do, and this frog doesn't do that either. So this is a very, very weird frog in terms of how it fits into the rule of what it means to be a frog. But I thought that's a unique thing that should be included here. So so most frogs, besides that one I just showed you, use external fertilization. So basically what happens is during the breeding season, usually males are calling, and then females will be selective towards those males. So a female might pick a male because she likes the way that male is calling, and then the male will clasp the female, and then that female will deposit eggs, and then the male will deposit sperm, and then that sperm will basically fertilize those eggs, and then that egg will develop into an embryo, and that embryo will develop into a tadpole, and then eventually that tadpole will develop into a terrestrial frog. But it's not always that easy, right? So there's exceptions to almost everything I say in this talk. So there's actually, and fair warning, this is going to be kind of a gross slide, I think. So this is called the Suriname toad. And so everything works the same in terms of the external fertilization, right? There's the egg. So I'll explain it here. So the female lays all these eggs, and I think the male courts her in some unique way. But the female lays the eggs. The male pushes the eggs on the female's back, and then those eggs basically stick to the female's back, and then this female undergoes some physiological change, and eventually those eggs kind of get absorbed into her skin. And what happens is it's these toadlets eventually come out of her skin, because again, this is kind of like a protection barrier. Like, they're at this vulnerable stage in life, so this is kind of giving them kind of a boost for a chance on survival after they're out of their eggs. But what happens is they kind of skip the tadpole stage. Right, remember that last slide? Most frogs have this tadpole stage when they're in the water. So essentially, what happens is you call this direct development. So the tadpole stage actually happens kind of inside the egg. So they're kind of skipping the tadpole stage here, but then they come out as these little, people call them toadlets. So that kind of gives them some type of competitive advantage instead of being this free roaming tadpole that's just kind of in the environment. I think this is a very, very cool frog. Another cool thing about this frog is that they do call. So they live exclusively underwater. They're totally aquatic, but they still call. So they make these clicking sounds underwater, which can be basically picked up by the females still. So you don't have to call. You don't have to be terrestrial. So I think that's fantastic and super interesting. Most frogs do have these mating calls, and so these calls are not only served, or the purpose of these calls is not only to attract mates, it's not only to attract females, but it's also used as a warning signal to other males. So as a frog is calling, it's trying to attract a mate in most cases, but it can also be used to warn other male frogs that, hey, like, I'm in my own territory, stay out of my space, type of signal, right? So a lot of frogs are territorial, and they kind of want to establish their space so that they can have a better chance of obtaining a female. So a lot of these some frogs have certain aggressive calls that they can do on top of like a normal advertisement call that can be kind of more signaling, more of a signal to another male that like is of a warning, like, hey, I've already claimed this space. And then some frogs will assess other frogs, and maybe another frog says, okay, I don't really care, like, I'm bigger than you, I have better traits, I'm gonna take your space. So again, it doesn't work all the time, right? Frogs will fight in some cases, and there's again a lot of diversity in these calls too. So some frogs have they make all sorts of different noises. Most frogs, their name comes from how their call sounds. But you can see that in this top picture, this is just a generic tree frog. You can see they have like one big vocal sac, but a lot of frogs also have dual vocal sacs. They have kind of the vocal sacs coming from the side of their, basically at their head rather than right under their head. So again, a lot of diversity here. And I'm going to try to play a few different frog calls too. Okay, so let's see if this works. So this is that same drift fence pond I was talking about before, where I did the study. So I want it, for anyone listening to the talk, I want you to listen very carefully, and I want you to try to figure out how many species are calling. So not how many individuals, but try to guess how many species are calling. And then after we listen for a little bit, I'll give you the answer. But just pay attention to the different sounds that you hear. So we'll see if anyone gets this right. I think you got this. So we'll play this video. Okay, so that I don't know if I can't technically see the chat right now, but if you guessed 3 species, you got it right. So congrats, but it's a little bit tricky because and this is actually what happens in nature a lot. A lot of time when you go to a certain pond at night, there's not going to be just one species there. Usually there's multiple species, and so sometimes it can be kind of difficult to assess maybe how many species are there because a lot of their calls can overlap. Some frog species are louder than others, but if you remember that video, there was kind of this like chuckling call. It kind of sounded like an evil laugh. That was a leopard frog call, and then you kind of notice that more low frequency like humming sound. That was a bullfrog. And then there were these kind of like these crickety noises. It's kind of hard to explain, but it sounded like kind of like a rattling sound. Those are those little tiny chorus frogs. So I think it's really cool that even those little tiny frogs can sound can be just as loud in some cases as those really big frogs, despite them being a lot smaller in size. Okay. Okay, and yeah, so here, these are this is what the species look like. So again, your bullfrogs, you get your leopard frogs here, and then your really, really small chorus frogs. So yeah, that's just and that there's I think we have about 11 species in total in that pond. So you can imagine, like, you know, what a pond would sound like with, you know, even more than 3 species, right? And so I'm going to just play a few different species of calls. So that last one I showed was a southern leopard frog, but here's a northern leopard frog. This is where they range. You can see this is a similar species to the last one I just played. But you can definitely tell it's a lot different. So I'll play this one too. So a little bit similar to the other leopard frog that you heard in the other video, but still a lot of variation. And you can see that this frog also has the kind of that dual vocal sac. And then this is what's called an eastern spadefoot toad. So this is also this is an explosive breeder. So they breed for like very short durations of time. But when they do breed, they breed in like hundreds of individuals. So like if you were to witness a breeding event, you would probably see like a massive, you know, either migration or a massive amount of males calling at the same time, which I haven't seen before and I hope to see someday. But this is what their calls sound like.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but they're saying that they cannot hear the videos.
Oh man, that's too bad. I will see. See if I go to my settings. Well, yeah, I guess if. Oh man.
Okay, I can help right now.
Okay, maybe, yeah, it might be on my end. I apologize. You gotta have the imagination of what they sound like.
If you stop sharing.
Yeah, of course. So on the left, and this is slides kind of showing kind of more tropical frogs that kind of live in these more moist, wet environments. Okay. On the top left, this is an African species. It's called a black rain frog. You can see in the middle we have a Brazilian horned toad, and then this species from South America, and then from Asia we have this weird species called a purple frog. I think it was discovered not too long ago. Very weird species. They live most of their lives underground. And then on this bright yellow frog on the left, it's called an Indian bullfrog. So you can see that these frogs can come in all sorts of different colors. And in the middle you can see there's that example of that Suriname toad again. Again, very bizarre shape compared to what you would think of as a normal, typical body plan of a frog. And then, of course, we have these, you know, beautiful dart frogs that come in all sorts of different colors, which are very charismatic and very popular in the pet trade. And then we also have species that are maybe considered more dry adapted. So we have a green toad on the left, and this is a cane toad. This is a really big species. Native to South America, very toxic species. And then we have things like those spadefoots. I showed you a clip of one calling earlier, which are generally considered more dry adapted. So they basically live underground and kind of these environments that don't receive as much rain, and they only really come out during these like really large rain events in the summertime. And then we have another example of a rain frog that's more dry adapted compared to the one that was on the last slide. And then we have this Colorado river toad and White's tree frog. So this is an Australian species. It's not a toad. It's more of a frog. So it kind of has more moist skin, but they typically live in these more kind of these drier environments, you could say. So again, we have species that kind of live in more wet environments and species that live in drier environments. And with that, we have incredible diversity. And this is an honorable mention frog. This is called the turtle frog. So they are native to Australia, Western Australia, and no one really knows much about the species at all. This species is, you would consider them data deficient, and not a lot of, I guess we don't really know much about their ecology, and it's because the species also does live underground for most of its life. So it's very secretive, and it's really, really hard to witness the species in the wild. What we do know is that they eat termites, so they're a termite specialist. And they also have this direct development where they have this tadpole and toadlet stage that comes out of the egg, right? So they don't really have the situation where they have free roaming tadpoles that are like in ponds. And this is probably happens because the species again is more dry adapted. Maybe there's not permanent bodies of water long enough to hold tadpoles. So maybe over time they've kind of evolved this way to kind of skip that phase. And then frogs also have very powerful camouflage, right? So this is on top left. These are two pictures of the same species. This is called a Malayan leaf toad. You can see that for almost 100% this thing looks like a leaf. If you were in the wild walking around in the woods, I would even have a hard time finding this species because it looks like any other leaf on the ground, unless you look at it from a different angle, of course. But then you also have frogs that are blending into plant matter and moss. So this is a cool example. This is called a mossy frog, and they're not only does their color really match some of their background, but they also have this like texturized skin that kind of mimics the way moss kind of looks, right? So it's kind of again very texturized and helps it blend even more into its background. And then maybe some of you might be familiar if you're in the United States, but we also have gray tree frogs, which do incredibly well against like bark and woods and wooded backgrounds. So again, they kind of have this very cool gray kind of blotch pattern, which helps it kind of mimic kind of the wood it might sit upon. So a lot of frogs do have camouflage, which is very, very, very interesting and very unique. And there's also a frog species called a bird poop frog, and this is a very bizarre frog. So it's basically it's mimicking bird poop. So it's basically it likes to hang out in these areas where a lot of birds might be pooping on the rocks. And so basically kind of the idea here is not only are they hard to find because they kind of mimic this bird poop background, but they might not look as appetizing to predators. What predator is going to want to eat a frog that looks like poop? So that's kind of a more funny example. But yeah, so frogs also come in these very, very easy to see colors. They're very bright, and these basically are these colors are kind of used as signals for other animals. So we call it aposematism, and which is basically like kind of a warning coloration to predators to say, hey, like I'm a dangerous food to eat. So this typically includes colors like oranges and reds, and even blues. And these colors are kind of meant to contrast strongly with the background, so they're very, very, very easy to see. And typically, a lot of these frogs that have these colorations are toxic. So it is a good indicator again to predators to say, hey, do not eat me. You will not have a good time. But of course, there's frogs that will mimic these colors that aren't actually toxic. So again, these colors are really useful signals to frogs to, I guess, protect them from being eaten. And then a cool example of kind of an extreme of these dart frogs is called the golden poison arrow frog, and it's the largest of the dart frogs. And I think the statistic is one individual has enough, I guess, toxin to kill anywhere between 10 to 12 people. There's a lot of, I guess, there used to be a lot of indigenous people that would kind of use these frogs for hunting purposes, where they would kind of use the secretions on their skin on the tip of their arrows, which would again help would basically help, kill cool animals they were searching for, which is a pretty unique thing. But then also frogs can be all sorts of shapes and sizes. So some frogs can be extremely small. This is a species that was discovered in 2012, and they're a fraction of the size of a dime, right? So you can imagine how hard this species is to, witness in nature. It would probably be very easy to overlook something like this. But frogs can also be very, very large. This is the largest species of frog in the world. It's called the Goliath frog, and they can be well over a foot long. And sometimes some of these bigger frogs are, again, kind of pointed on for food. So this frog is actually, I guess, considered endangered now, but kind of the primary cause leading to their endangerment has been because of things like the food and the pet trade. So again, some of these frogs that are really big, they're really popular in food, but that can also lead to declines, right? And it's just some basic vocabulary. So I also like to kind of tell people, people are always like, what's the difference between a frog and a toad? So frogs refer to like a smooth skin aquatic jumper. So this is what you would think of as like a typical frog, right? So the genus would be Rana, and the family is Ranidae. So this is like what it means to be a true frog. And they all kind of have the same body plan. They kind of have like a pointier snout. They all kind of have the same, body shape, if you will. Again, they're all very, very slimy usually, and they're pretty aquatic compared to other frogs. And actually, if you think about most frog characters that are in like children books or in TV shows, a lot of these frog characters are based on these true frogs or these ranid frogs. So like Kermit the Frog would probably be based on this these frogs that would be considered true frogs. And then you have characters like Toad and Frog. Again, this frog here is probably based on like a bullfrog or a green frog, which would be considered a true frog. And then toads would be different from frogs in that they refer to like more of a warty, dry-skinned, terrestrial hopper. So they're maybe not as much jumping, but more of a hopping situation. So these are two examples of some toads that live in the U.S. We have Fowler's toads and Great Plains toads. Again, you can kind of see the representation from frog and toad. We kind of have this like bump or this fort on toad. But this vocabulary is not really super definite, and again, I think the way I put it is not all frogs are toads, but all toads are frogs. So I would be careful with how you define which one over the other, because you could take an eastern green tree frog, which would generally be a frog, right? But someone might say, okay, like their skin's kind of bumpy and warty per se, and same with spadefoots. People refer to spadefoots as spadefoot toads, but again, they have like usually pretty smooth skin, and they're pretty much only exclusively using these aquatic environments during the breeding season. So there are exceptions for this, but I would just generally use frogs as a generic term. So it's totally okay to call a toad a frog, in my opinion. And then you have things you have a group called spadefoots, which essentially use they're called spadefoot because they have a shovel on their foot, which they use for digging. So you can see in this photo right here, if you were to turn its hind feet over, you'd see this black keratinized piece on their webbing. So they use that again to dig it under the ground. And we have a bunch of species in North America, but what's really cool about the species, in my opinion, is they smell like peanut butter. So if you were to, I found them before, like on the road, and I picked them up. And it is true, like when you smell them and smell your hands afterwards, it smells like peanut butter. So don't ask me why they smell like peanut butter, but they do. But yeah, there's again some pretty common differences between spadefoots and other frogs, mostly in their head shape and kind of how much their eyes kind of pop out of their head. What's really cool about this species is their ability to adapt to changes in the environment. So basically, these tadpoles they basically have what's called phenotypic plasticity, which means it's one genotype that can code for multiple phenotypes. So what this means is under different environmental scenarios, you can have one body plan or the other. So in a situation where there's a lot of rain and there's a lot of vegetation in the environment, typically these tadpoles will remain they will remain eating plants because there's plentiful food around. But in situations where ponds may be drying, and if they accidentally eat shrimp, they can sometimes turn into what are called these carnivore morphs, which will essentially make them, I guess, grow a lot faster, grow a lot bigger, develop different morphological characters in their teeth anatomy, and they will actually cannibalize their own and eat each other. And again, this is kind of giving them kind of this advantage in situations where environmental conditions might not be ideal for survival. So this is kind of a cool example in how certain frogs can, I guess, adapt in certain situations. And I guess, how am I on time? I know it's 9:55. I wanted to ask real quick.
We can open up for some questions if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, it's totally fine. I didn't get through everything, but so I apologize.
I can't hear you.
I'm happy to answer some questions.
I think so. Can you repeat what you said? You were muted.
Oh, sorry. I didn't hear you.
Oh, we asked if you want to open up to some questions.